Well, good morning, good evening, good nights. Whenever you're watching this replay, I want to welcome you to Red Fury Books. If this is your first time here because you followed one of these fine gentlemen to my channel, welcome. We're going to talk about classic fantasy today. And I'm really excited to have just this great distinguished panel here. But let me tell you a little bit first about why I wanted to have this specific discussion about classic fantasy today. The reason is a couple months ago, I was reading a book by a modern author that was written about 5 years ago. And I just kept reading it and thinking, this is a work of classic fantasy, but it wasn't written at the time that we consider classic fantasy. So I did a little bit of research, no, not research. I did a little bit of Googling and Google told me that basically Robert Jordan is the dividing line between classic fantasy and modern fantasy, at least on the 3 or 4 sites that I saw. And I thought that was so simplistic, and I wanted to examine this topic a little bit more further. So I thought instead of doing my own video, I thought it'd be a lot of fun to bring together some great booktubers that I really enjoy talking with and enjoy watching their channels and talking about this topic. So before I get into it, an even more long-winded intro, let me introduce the panel. If for some reason you don't know these guys and their channels, I highly recommend all 3. If I had to pick my top 3 channels on BookTube where I learn the most, it's these 3 channels. So let's just go around the horn and want to introduce each of them. And I'm going to ask each of them to share the first work that they read in the fantasy genre, because it's probably a work of classic fantasy, and it's probably something that we will talk about in this discussion today. So first of all, I want to welcome to the channel AP from A Critical Dragon. So AP, what was the first work of fantasy that you read?
Well, thanks for having me on for this. As I had mentioned just before we started, I'm trying to think of like an exact title, but what it comes down to, the one that really sticks out in my mind, because I was reading a lot of books as a kid, and my memory's shockingly bad for that. I was only wee, but there was one book that really stood out, and my grandparents had bought it for me, and it was a book of Celtic mythology. And they were working under the assumption that these were Celtic fairy tales and that very Disney sort of form of fairy tale, but this was Celtic mythology. And so it was very dark. A lot of very bad things happen in it, and was quite adult. And for me, there's a big distinction between actual mythology and what we talk about in terms of fantasy. There's overlap, but they're not the same thing. But how I read it at that time was very much as a series of short fantasy stories. And that one has really stuck out in my mind as something that, maybe looking back on it, slightly inappropriate for a 9-year-old. But at the same time, it consolidated for me this form of writing, this style of writing, that these fantastical events that were pseudo-historical, pseudo-fantastical, this blend of approach to narrative and storytelling that was very different to the science fiction stories that I read that were quite often about technology and gadgets. At that stage, that's not the whole of science fiction, but at that stage it was technology and gadgets, or the 3 investigators and the Hardy Boys, which were, kids going off and solving things, or even the Enid Blyton books. But for me, yeah, it was that adult Celtic mythology anthology that was quite eye-opening.
Nice, very cool. Philip Chase from Philip Chase, The Best of Fantasy. What was the first thing that you read in this genre?
Well, thank you, Josh. I'd like to echo AP and thanking you for inviting us for this discussion. I'm really excited to talk with the 3 of you about this topic. The first one I can remember that left a strong enough impression on me, I was probably around 11 or so when I read The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. And it was a very memorable experience. I haven't reread it as you have recently, but I still remember Taran the Pig Keeper, and what was his name? Gurgi, I think was the name of the yeah. So it left a strong impression on me. I've said numerous times on this platform that Tolkien was the author who baptized my imagination, and I read Tolkien a little bit later, probably around the age of 12. And that was an incredibly moving experience for me. That opened the door to this lifelong adventure in fantasy. Probably explains a lot of my life's path, but certainly introduced me to the feeling of catharsis, getting to the end of Lord of the Rings and just being completely overwhelmed by all the emotions, the joy and the sorrow and the just an incredible combination of all that, plus a sense of clarity that I knew I was experiencing something very special there. So I think that experience, more than anything, explains my love of this genre. And of course, I think all of us would probably agree that Tolkien qualifies as classic fantasy. So probably will be relevant to this discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, Bridger from the Library Ladder, what was the first work of fantasy that you read?
Well, thanks, Josh. And thank you to AP and Philip for participating in this with me. I feel very much like an amateur here in this group because I am an amateur and you all are professionals, but I am a lifelong enthusiast. I will describe myself that way. My story may sound a lot like the others in that, I mean, I read a lot of children's books that were fantastical, but I wouldn't necessarily describe them as an introduction to fantasy. I mean, yes, technically they are fantasy, but I didn't really, at least to my recollection, I don't think I ever encountered a secondary world story until I first read The Hobbit. And that was on the recommendation of my teacher. I was about 11 at the time. And my teacher just put this book in my hand, a little paperback Ballantine edition of The Hobbit, and said, "You really need to read this." And I mean, I didn't really know anything about it at the time. And I read it and was completely captivated. And from that point forward, I actively sought out other similar types of stories. I mean, Lloyd Alexander was not long after The Hobbit for me, definitely one of the early types of books that shaped a lot of my reading preferences going forward. And I did reread it recently, like you, Josh. I read it a couple of years ago for a middle grade book club that I led for a number of years and loved it on a reread as a much older adult. So it's a kid's book, but adults can definitely enjoy it as well.
Fantastic. And I have to thank Philip for pronouncing it for me, because my first foray into the fantasy genre was the Prydain Chronicles by Lloyd Alexander, which I always get confused about how to say it. So thank you, Philip, for starting at the same place that I did. But I did.
Who knew that learning Welsh would come in handy?
Yeah, right. No, and I think like you, I was 11 or 12, and it was literally my first day of middle school, and I saw it on the shelf in my library. I was so excited to go to the middle school library to see new books that I'd not experienced because I'd read everything in my elementary school, and I saw that cover with the antlers, and it just fired my imagination. And then that year, I remember that year very clearly. It was Lloyd Alexander, followed by Chronicles of Narnia, followed by Lord of the Rings. And it was, I haven't looked back from there. So I do love, and I did reread the Prydain Chronicles this year or 2 years ago, and really enjoyed them. And I think there's a lot of, I think anytime you read middle grade, you know that the themes are going to be a little bit less subtle, but they're still so well done, and they are very memorable. And I remembered Gurgi with his crunchings and munchings and all of that immediately when I started reading. So it was such a joy to revisit those, and to also find out that it wasn't just nostalgia, that I indeed loved them and they were worthy of kind of my younger self enjoying them. But let's talk about the topic at hand, just to elaborate a little bit more. And I think I shared this with all of you, is one thing I normally do in my life when I'm confronted with a question is, if I'm not sure the answer, and as I'm searching the answer, I try to find parallels in areas where I do have expertise, which for me is music. And I was thinking about this question about classic fantasy, and it had me starting thinking about musical eras. And in music history, for instance, we learn that the Baroque era, historians kind of put the end of the Baroque era at 1750 with the death of Bach. But that doesn't mean that like one day everybody's writing Baroque music, Bach dies, now we're writing classical music. That's not how it worked. Just as if we arbitrarily assign classic fantasy ending with Robert Jordan or some other place, it's not like there were not people doing different things before and after. So I started thinking about this and started thinking about when I look at a piece of music, you look at the stylistic traits. And I think literature is very similar in the same vein, that we can look at this in this specific genre fiction and talk about the stylistic traits. And that's kind of what I want the bulk of today's discussion to be, is to talk about the stylistic traits of what we consider today classic fantasy. And then we'll get into kind of some of the books that we love that have these, and talk about a bunch of other things. But first question I'd like to pose all of you is just kind of big picture before we kind of roll up our sleeves and delve into kind of the specificity of the style of classic fantasy. Is big picture. When I say classic fantasy, what do each of you think about?
I think you could actually break it up if you want to. And yeah, you're absolutely right, Josh, that I think when most people hear the phrase classic fantasy, they're thinking of stylistic traits. They're thinking of perhaps a more descriptive writing style. They're thinking of writing that takes inspiration from probably European older times, medieval and prior. But you could also, one direction you could come from is to, okay, what is classic and what is fantasy? AP alluded to that earlier when he said, I read mythology. I don't quite think it's the same as fantasy. So we could even spend time defining those terms individually and perhaps arriving at an interesting viewpoint thereby. So what is a classic? That's actually a really big question.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
I completely agree. I mean, we have to define terms before we can have a meaningful conversation. Otherwise, we're going to be sort of talking across one another rather than to one another. And I completely agree with you, Philip. I mean, what actually are we talking about with classic? Is it, as Josh said, how many people perceive it as time-based? Classic means old. Does it mean stylistic, like certain types of either tropes or the types of language that's used, the settings, the inspirations for it? Or are we talking about it in terms of, and this is how I'd like to use classic, but it probably isn't the way a lot of other people use it. I don't really like using classic in that sense. I use classic in the sense that it's timeless. And that, because you can have modern classics, meaning it is a book or a work of some kind that has qualities that will allow it to stand the test of time. That regardless of what time period it was written in, it could be an old work, but either because of the influence it has had on later authors and works, or just on the timeless quality of the story it's telling, the themes that it describes, the language, how evocative it is, and does it continue to resonate in future generations? All of those things make it a classic. But there are classics being written right now that I would call classic, that have nothing to do with anything that happened before, if that makes any sense at all. So I tend to think in terms of traditional fantasy rather than classic fantasy. But that's kind of a semantic distinction.
Well, as both of you have pointed out, when we refer to something as a classic, we're using the term in a very, very different way, because we're talking about this is a classic. This is going to have a timeless quality. But when we refer to it as it is classical, we're not using the same term. We mean something different. So classical fantasy is not synonymous with or linked to this is a classic, because just how we use those terms, they vary very radically. But if you think of any other literary genre, subgenre, or even time period, you talk about the Gothic. This is a Gothic novel. And you go, right, but do we mean Gothic as in what the novel is doing? Do we mean Gothic as in the setting? Do we mean we use these terms very, very differently depending on what the thing is, because someone can write a Gothic novel today and you go, we're not in the Gothic period. It has nothing to do with the Gothic period, but it's written in or evoking a sense of that period or that style. So these terms are very, very flexible and porous. And one of the things that I think people get tied up in the semantic arguments, and these arguments are important. Defining your terms, or if you're a business major, operationalizing your terms is very, very important, because it means then that everyone is on the same page about what we're discussing. But if you talk about a romance, and we could be doing a 19th century romance, that's not the same as the genre romance, which is entirely different, because we're lazy. We just use the same words over and over again for radically different things, which leads to this confusion. And even when we talk about the genre of fantasy is retrospectively applied. All genres are retrospectively applied, that we identify a core group of texts that seemingly are doing similar things. We attach a term to that and then look back to go, oh, these other things were doing it as well. And thus a genre is established. So when we even talking about fantasy as a genre, that doesn't really coalesce until Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, despite the fact that there were loads of texts and stories and novels and short stories that had these fantastical elements, and that if they were published today, we would call fantasy. But because they were published before the term fantasy was being applied to the genre, they get, oh, it's a planetary romance. Oh, it's sword and sorcery. It's sword and sandals. It's historic. It's a lost land tale. If we even talking about secondary worlds, the Hollow Earth stories and the Lost Land stories, those are all evocations very much of what we do with the division of setting into secondary world. That it's that separation from the real world, the mundane, and this fantastical reality. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree that being clear about what we mean by classic, because something can be classic because it has that longevity. It is a classic. But if we're talking about classical fantasy, we're talking about a codification of something within the genre, which has certain stylistic traits or is evoking a sense of something in particular. And that's kind of how I would come at this, because you could look at Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter. Is that fantasy? Oh, well, it's fairy tale. All right, so we're making a distinction between fairy, but it's not a true fairy tale. It's a fictional fairy tale, but isn't that what fantasy is? And suddenly it becomes very, very complicated. And we have quite often quite simplistic, reductive, concrete boxes that we like to put things in. But this is literature, like any form of art. There is bleed over, and it is messy, and it is drawing things from all over the place. So yeah, I completely agree that these terms, depending on how we use them, actually imply very different concepts. And just having a rough idea of what it is that we want to discuss, it is probably a good starting point.
It's also worth. It's worth mentioning. Sorry, I'll make a quick point, and I'll cede to you, Bridger. It's worth mentioning that the word fantasy to describe this genre was not around until around 1940 or so. I think it was in Weird Tales or somewhere where it was first coined that way. You mentioned Dunsany. They weren't calling it fantasy when he was writing. They weren't when William Morris wrote his prose romances in the 1890s. That there was nothing called fantasy back then. So it is interesting to see the evolution of this as a term. And of course, there was nothing like classic fantasy because there was no fantasy even, right? So this is something we've only been talking about fairly recently. So sorry, Bridger, I didn't mean to step on you there.
No, and I'd just follow on with what you were saying. I'd say that it didn't really coalesce as a genre until probably the 1960s. As having a distinct identity where people were actively categorizing things in that way and being marketed very explicitly, because even in the 1940s, while the term did come into use there, it still had a lot of fuzziness because it was still considered a subset of science fiction to a large extent. And a lot of the writers of fantasy at that time in the 40s and 50s were trying to make their fantasy stories fit a lot of the conventions that were expected of science fiction stories. So they had fantastical elements, but they had science fiction sensibilities in many respects, not all, but it wasn't really until the 1960s and the paperback edition of The Lord of the Rings and all of the popular attention that it garnered that suddenly it gained its own identity. But I also wanted to go back to something AP said, because AP was making reference to some of the subgenres in fantasy and how you define classic within different subgenres is likely to be very different. I mean, there's obviously classic heroic fantasy, epic fantasy, high fantasy, you know, the things that most typically or stereotypically are thought of as fantasy. There's a definite general sense of what's classic and what's something other than classic, whether it's modern, postmodern, whatever. But then if you look at things like urban fantasy, you know, what's a classic urban fantasy? There are some,
Yeah.
but I mean, it has evolved over time. The paranormal, the new weird, romantasy. You've got lit RPG now. Where does that fit in? I mean, how do we evaluate those using the same criteria for, you know, the stylistic conventions, the author intentions, the reader expectations, all of those things that help define, you know, what makes something a classic or what makes something a fantasy for that matter.
Bridger, I liked when you changed kind of the question of classic fantasy to more traditional fantasy, because I think that is kind of what I was envisioning kind of the discussion about, is more about classic in the sense of more traditional type of storytelling versus how fantasy has changed. And I think a lot of the subgenres that you talked about, they are a lot newer for the most part. And a lot of those are kind of more modern conventions for the most part. At least by putting a name on them. I don't know when we heard the word grimdark, but it's certainly in the last 20 years, probably, if not sooner. Things like magic systems that were not a thing when a lot of these works we're talking about. So as far as to maybe try to focus what our discussion is, I think what I wanted to just talk about mostly are kind of this, I guess, the stylistic traits of more traditional fantasy, I think is probably the way to frame that.
So using classic in the sense of representative of the thing. This is a classic detective noir. What do we mean by that? It represents all of the aspects of detective noir that we associate with that genre.
Yes,
that's what you mean by,
not
that's what you
necessarily
mean
a classic. Yes, yeah. Which you alluded to that. So yeah, I definitely agree that there is a difference between classic kind of as an adjective versus a noun, you know, whether it's a classic or it's a classic representation of something. So that's what I'm envisioning is talking about those stylistic things, because that's where I went to when I started thinking about like Baroque music versus classical music and Rococo and all of those things. So,
and this is where you run into your first roadblock, because, you know, we go, okay, so what's representative of the tradition of fantasy? You go, okay, define the tradition of fantasy. And, you know, I don't mean to throw definitional arguments at people, but you know, we talk about the evocation, say, as I alluded to earlier, about myth and folklore and fairy tale. Now, those are all distinct. Those are all distinct things in and of themselves that have a different relationship with their audience, a different relationship with the author and what they are trying to do. But fantasy shamelessly stole from all of those things and was doing it in a slightly different way. We can talk about the prose romances of the 19th century, or the fantastical prose romances, or the Bildungsroman that were using these things. We can look at the religious allegorical fantasies. You know, things like Dante's Divine Comedy. That's a fantastical journey that someone goes on, or Pilgrim's Progress. That we, in trying to define those things and looking at this vast history, because epic fantasy draws on the epics, and you know, there's 2,000 years of history of literature that is being evoked in these things, but evoked in a slightly different way. And fantasy as a genre is one of those ones that's very difficult to define. Having spent time trying to do this, because some of the definitions are things like it is non-mimetic. So defining it in the negative, not by what it is doing, but what it isn't doing, which is representation of the real. And you go, well, that includes science fiction, that includes horror, that includes all of these other things. You go, okay, so if it includes magic, you go, but what if it just has a dragon in it and no magic at all? That's still fantasy. And again, trying to define fantasy by what it does is actually exceptionally difficult, which is why you have scholars writing entire books about how to try to define fantasy, because it seems so obvious to us when we look at it and go, yeah, I know what fantasy is when I point at it. You're like, great, now design the rules and apply those, and you'll suddenly see that there's a whole load of things that you didn't intend will fall into that bucket that you've created. So the tradition of fantasy, a classic representation of what fantasy does, it all hinges again on a previous definition, which is, well, okay, what is it that fantasy does? What is this tradition that we're going to be discussing? And you can see how this gets further and further away from the thing that we actually want to talk about.
Well, to get to that, to try to do what you're asking us to do here, Josh, I'm going to throw out something. Let's start with the prose. Ursula Le Guin has a wonderful essay that all of you are probably aware of, From Elfland to Poughkeepsie. The way that Ursula Le Guin defines prose in that essay, I think I would put forward that perhaps we could consider that prose to be equivalent to classic fantasy. What she advocates in that essay is prose that allows the reader to feel immersed in a different world, because it's not the same as say modern prose. So you have, I think in the essay she brilliantly contrasts some writers like Dunsany and Tolkien with a more modern style of writing. And the modern style, she takes an excerpt from contemporary fantasy that reads essentially like it could just replace the names with Poughkeepsie or Newark or whatever, and no problem. It could be set in the present, right? So Le Guin is advocating for prose that tells the reader, you're in a different world here. This is not our world. And it could be, it doesn't have to necessarily be, but it often is archaic. Let's say pseudo-archaic, because the language that William Morris uses, or Lord Dunsany, or whoever, that language never actually existed anywhere. It is stylized language, but stylized in a sense that it allows the reader to feel that they are now immersed in a different world. So I would submit to you that there's one, perhaps a criterion that we could put forward as a, and this is going to be totally imperfect, and I can see my nemesis already ready to shoot this down. But we could throw that out there, because I think people do, when they think of classic fantasy, they're thinking in stylistic terms. But now I'll let everybody shoot holes in that right now.
Let me jump in. I'm not going to disagree, not exactly, because I think it is true what you're saying, and what Le Guin was saying in that essay, that older, more traditional fantasies did feel more immersive because the language that was used to tell the story, whether it was dialogue or just the descriptive narrative, whatever, felt of that time or of that place. And more modern fantasy tends to relax a lot of those conventions in some ways. Like, they'll do a hybrid where some use of archaic terms helps to give a flavor, but then you've got just very modern, almost Hemingway-esque sentence construction and paragraph construction, no paragraphs, just one sentence after another. And I think the example that she used in that essay was Catherine Kurtz's Derini trilogy from the 1970s. And the irony there is, from Le Guin's perspective, when she wrote that essay, Kurtz was modern. The thing is, today, most readers would probably look back at Kurtz's Derini Rising, and I'm a fan of Derini, her Derini series. I think it's well done, but it is not as modern as a lot of works that have been written in the last 20 years or so. And so where it's really a continuum of, you can't necessarily say that one thing is modern or isn't modern. It's more a matter of degrees of how far along that continuum they've gone, just using prose as the criterion. And to give another example, and this is modern, this is very, very, very modern, and yet it's not in other respects. I recently read Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, and I, partly out of curiosity, partly because I have teenage daughters and I just like to know what they may or may not be reading. And so I guess I can talk to them about it. And so I read it, and I was almost in shock with how modern the language is in that book. So much so that it was, for me at least, very jarring. There are anachronisms in the language. There are terms that are used, slang and other terms that would, in the sort of quasi-medieval setting that the book is set in, would have no meaning whatsoever. I mean, they would not have any idea what these terms are because they technologically or sociologically would not have advanced to a level where they would have this type of terminology. And everything is written as if it's being written by a 21st century young person, which makes absolutely no sense from a world building standpoint. There's so many discontinuities in the book. At the same time, though, it is one of the most popular books in the modern fantasy genre today, and clearly is resonating with a lot of people as being representative of fantasy. And yet a lot of the things that it does, in many respects, are actually throwbacks to very traditional fantasy. On the plot is very much just an update of plots that have been written for many, many, many decades. There's very little originality in it. So it's this strange hybrid of very traditional storytelling and yet this very almost discordant modern flavor to it in the prose. Now, I don't know if you all have read it, but that was something that came to mind because I just read it not too long ago.
I think we would agree that Fourth Wing is not yet at least classic fantasy.
Maybe in terms of the future impact it has. Who knows?
And like I said at the beginning, a lot of these terms get applied retrospectively. You need time between them to trace out impact and audience interaction and whether or not that trend continues to develop. You could look at some of the books that came out and went, oh, this was wildly popular. People are going to follow this, but then that trend just disappears really, really quickly. And we're seeing a much faster cycle of trends in terms of subgenre and subgenre happening a lot faster now than it used to be, because we just have an accelerated consumption rate. But the point that Bridger brought up there about, it's the translation conceit. When we read, say, a secondary world fantasy, obviously they're not all speaking English. It's a conceit of this world is being evoked for the contemporary reader, the person reading it. And because of that, an author is negotiating between authenticity to, say, a secondary world or an alien world, and what is going to be comprehensible to a reader. And that translation conceit, if your book is intended for a young adult audience or a teen audience or a tween audience, the language has to be understandable for the audience to interpret what is happening. And therefore, although the terminology used is not necessarily going to be reflective of an authentic recreation of that secondary world or that evoked time period, if it conveys the meaning, then it's effective writing. And it's the, it's the translation conceit. But to go back to Philip's point, Le Guin has that. I love that essay. I agree with a lot of what Le Guin says, but it's not unique to fantasy. Gothic, the Gothic writing, a lot of the use of the prose to evoke the sense of the Gothic, and the Gothic is, quite often elaborate, archaic. A lot of the things that we associate with fantasy. So it's not solely fantasy that does this, or science fiction, the cognitive estrangement that Suthen talks about. When we think of how the language of science fiction is often used to evoke that sense of the strange, the startling, the alien, and the actual language on the page is used to put the reader in that mode. And again, it's not unique to fantasy that the stylistic or the use of language, what Le Guin, and even if we looked solely at archaism, but archaism can be used in historical fiction, and archaism can be used in the Gothic and in mythological storytelling. Those things all use archaism in that way. So Le Guin's major point that the shaping of language to evoke a sense of setting, place, and style, that I absolutely agree with. That it is unique to fantasy? No, it's not. It's one of those tools in a writer's toolbox. And that's my problem with using that as sort of a defining aspect of traditional or classic fantasy.
I think we would have to agree that it's only one criterion, and that by itself is not sufficient, but that it is one criterion that is likely to be present in most people's thinking about what is classic fantasy, at least. So yeah, but by itself, insufficient. Yeah,
I know, but so now we're doing what people think classic fantasy is, as opposed to what classic fantasy actually is. We're now second guessing what the general public are going to think about it, because I'm wildly out of my depth on that
one. All right, let me throw out another.
Sorry, Bridger, go ahead.
No, I was going to throw out another potential criterion. I think it sounds like we're generally in agreement that prose matters, but it's not definitive. And there are lots of exceptions, both traditional and modern, when it comes to prose. But as a general trend, there does seem to be some connection there. What about the idea that as fantasy has evolved over time, there has been, in terms of the author's intent, but it shows up in the expression in the story itself, how the story is written, the intent to be transgressive, to push boundaries, to explore extremes of different types. I mean, this is kind of what Michael Moorcock has argued for decades about, that, and why he hates Tolkien. And I don't necessarily agree with his scathing review of Tolkien, but some of his analysis, I think, does have merit in terms of author intent. And he puts, rather than putting just a descriptive value on it, he puts on sort of a normative value, like what authors should be doing. And that's where I really disagree with Moorcock. But he tends to argue that good fantasy is fantasy that is trying to change the world, change readers' understandings of things.
Subversive.
I mean, transgressive. And he certainly put a lot of that into play in his own writing. And he tends to favor authors who do much the same thing. But if you look at 30,000 foot level and look at the evolution of the fantasy genre, it is cyclical. Certain types of stories come into vogue, They stick around for, a couple of decades, and then they fall out of fashion and something new takes its place. And you get more of the proliferation of different subgenres along at the same time. But even those subgenres, as they come into being, a lot of times they're borrowing from much older traditions. And so it's, again, recycling older things. But as it moves along, each iteration of that cycle tends to be a little more extreme, a little more violent, a little more sexually explicit, a little more maybe emotionally fraught in how the story is told, and whether it's from the point of view, first person type of perspective, where you're really experiencing the angst and fear and anxiety and other things that the characters are experiencing. But as just a general, very broad trend, I think that is true. Again, there are lots of exceptions to that on an individual level, but it does seem as if that transgressive boundary pushing is a force underlying a lot of this. And how much of that is the authors trying to push boundaries, and how much of it is the audience, the readers, saying, hey, we want something more than what we've been getting, because all of this stuff that's been written seems a lot the same. Stories are getting repeated, themes are repeated. The sensation that I'm getting is not as intense as it once was. I need something more sensational. So give me something more sensational. And I don't know the answer.
For the sake of our definition, then, are you suggesting, Bridger, that classic fantasy tends not to be as subversive? Is that what we're suggesting?
Yes. I mean, again, this is as a broad trend. Right. Again, with exceptions. There are definitely exceptions that can be identified.
Okay.
But I'm just making just a very, in the aggregate kind of argument.
And that's framing it as a negative. I guess we could possibly put that as a positive, but AP has something to say, I think.
Well, because I think Bridger has identified the very clear thing. Authors within the genre, when they perceive what the genre is doing, and then they may want to write their story to conform to that, which is where we would lean in terms of a representation of classic fantasy, the evocation of the perceived narrative norms, or they want to react against it, which is something like obviously Moorcock was arguing very, very strongly about. You saw that in a lot of 2000 AD, the British comic series that was arguing against a lot of the American comics. And there was a certain movement in the UK at that time. Like, that's where we get the whole Warhammer world from, and the origin of the term grimdark. But the idea of a perceived base norm, or a perceived narrative norm, that Moorcock sort of feels is conciliatory and is calming and is a pablum being fed to the audience, and he wanted something that was sharper, more challenging. And so in order to react against it, you had to establish what the thing was, and he was clearly reacting against what he saw in Tolkien, and he has a very particular view of Tolkien's works. Some of those points I think are spot on. Others I would have more trouble accepting. But that cyclical nature, because once Moorcock or any author does that and reacts against the perceived norm, and then that gains popularity, that becomes the perceived norm, which is going to exactly what Bridger was talking about, this cyclical nature of something that is new, innovative, and challenging. Once it is repeated often enough, it becomes standard, normal. And therefore, in order to react against that, you try to find different friction points. So a couple of years back, we saw the rise of the term cozy fantasy, as if this was a new, and it was a reaction against a lot of the hyper-violence or darkness or grit that was found. It was, but let's do cozy fantasy, as if that was a new thing. And yet we know that this is just an evocation of similar sort of stories that is conciliatory in some way. So what each generation or each sort of iteration of fantasy over time, you can look at particularly in the 70s and the rise of the popularity of fantasy, the establishment of fantasy in the 80s, and then the reactions against it in the 90s. To each time, there's a different sort of base norm being explored. And the things that become wildly popular, do people emulate it or do people react against it? And it's a fascinating period in fantasy history, the 80s and 90s, where we see the evolution of and the production of the franchise and RPG based fantasy fictions, which were drawing very heavily on a bunch of different things to market and link to ludic responses. The whole popularity of the idea of the magic system, that's all RPGs. Because before then it was magic, and there may have been a rationale behind it, but we didn't need it systematized. But for a game, it had to be a system. So we see a lot of that happening. And then you have people reacting against this perceived dominance of magic system as a thing and going, well, now we're going to use something softer that doesn't have these hard defined edges, as if it is a new thing. But all it is that continuation of a cycle of us establishing a common conceit or a commonality or a general term or a general concept and going, right, well, I'm going to do something different. And this happens in all genres.
Yeah.
I
It's interesting
agree.
because you mentioned
go ahead,
soft.
Paul.
Oh, yeah, I'll be real quick. Soft magic, as they say these days, as the kids say these days. I think a lot of, again, I'm going to the public perception here, AP, because, I have my finger on the pulse of the popular stuff right now. So, but I think a lot of people, modern fantasy readers, do think of soft magic, as it were, as being equating it with classic fantasy. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I think that's in the heads of a lot of people for sure. But anyway, sorry, Bridger, go ahead.
I was just going to say, kind of echoing what AP was talking about, that you have that innovation, and then you have people who are copying it and saying, hey, there's the innovator. That's really cool. Let's do what they're doing. And then you get all of these imitators, which then leads to stagnation. And the stagnation is what a lot of people, I think about when they think of all of those cookie cutter fantasies from the 1980s that were either Dungeons and Dragons clones or Tolkien clones in many respects. And people got really sick of them because they started feeling very much the same. And that led to a backlash. And so that's part of that cycle. And as AP said, this has been going on a long time. I mean, if you go back hundreds of years ago, I was just talking about this in a recent video using the Arthurian epics as an example. I mean, the Arthurian epics went through that exact cycle over several hundred years, right, until you had Cervantes saying, this is BS. What are you talking about? And so he wrote Don Quixote to skewer specifically a lot of what had been going on in the Arthurian legends for the hundreds of years before then. It's just now it's a lot more compressed in how that cycle plays out. And I feel the same way about certain types of heroic, epic, political fantasies, things that kind of fall into the Game of Thrones model. Clearly Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire was perceived as an innovator, along with some others, but it probably had the largest impact of some that were being written right at that time in the mid to late 1990s. How many copycats have you all read that are just basically pulling from Martin's playbook? Many, many, many. And some of them are quite good, but they start to blend together, at least in my mind. There was a period, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago, where I actually read a whole bunch of those fantasy series that were being written that essentially were copying Martin. I can't remember half of them. I mean, they've all blended together in my brain because they weren't distinctive. And I think I'm feeling the same way that readers felt in the 1990s, going back to, well, all of that, cookie cutter fantasy that was being written back in the 80s just didn't do it for them, and they wanted something different. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, what's really fascinating about that, because if you think of Terry Brooks' Sword of Shannara and you think of Robert Jordan's Eye of the World, those let's just say they have some inspiration taken from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings.
Just a wee bit.
But one of the reasons they were massively popular is people wanted something like the Lord of the Rings. Now, both authors went on and developed their series in different directions, but to initially get readers hooked, they were copying and deliberately marketing to fans of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. With the D&D and various franchises with RPG literature, the first trilogy for the Forgotten Realms was actually a dark Celtic fairy tale inspired trilogy by Douglas Niles. I think it was like the Moonshade trilogy. But the one that proved even more popular was R.A. Salvatore's Icewind Dale trilogy. But they were radically different. Then there was the Ravenloft whole series that they did for that game, which was all horror inspired, but with elements of fantasy. And so within even the Forgotten Realms, you had all of these different authors experimenting with different styles. And yeah, some of them are truly, truly terrible stories. But there was a wealth and a breadth of approaches that it wasn't just that this is just D&D, but there was something to that in that there were some stylistic elements. The idea of a core group of characters, 1, 2, small group of characters going on a journey, not necessarily a quest, but certainly taking that travel log element and going through and exploring aspects of, say, the Forgotten Realms setting, or the Dragonlance setting, which combined a lot of the dystopian science fictional stuff with a fantasy world. And we got Dragonlance, which felt very different, even though the first Dragonlance trilogy is so beholden to the rules that in the first book, if you count the number of spells that Raistlin uses, you know what level of magician he is, how many spells he has left, and you could probably guess which spell he has in reserve, because they were play testing and designing a game, and they novelized that whole sequence. It then became its own thing. So there's a weird thing that happens in that we want things that are familiar, but not too familiar, and we want novelty, but not too novel. That there's always kind of this sort of sweet spot for a general audience, and the evocation of Tolkien. People wanted that for the longest time until they went, right, well, now I'm bored of it. Why are people just writing Tolkien all day? It's like, because that's what everyone's been buying.
Yeah.
And so there was the reaction against it. And then that feels new, but similar enough that we're still comfortable with reading it, but new enough in a couple of respects that, oh, this feels new. It feels different. It's a breath of fresh air. Because you look at Game of Thrones and, oh, well, this is so radical, so new. And yeah, the War of the Roses, I haven't encountered that before. But in how Martin achieved it, what he did with it, that is great, and it's fantastic. It's a wonderful series. But let's not kid ourselves that he was wildly inventive, because there are huge chunks of that you go, oh, really? The Lannisters, not the Lancasters. Okay, right, fine.
Right. To go back to something that Josh mentioned in the beginning, and this relates very much to what UAP have been talking about, and Bridger as well, is that it seems from the current generation, our current moment, let's say, in the genre, looking back, it feels like there's this division somewhere in the 90s. And this relates to a lot of people, because you mentioned Robert Jordan is perceived as being this dividing line because of what you mentioned earlier, Eye of the World being very much inspired by Tolkien. And then later in the series, really him going in his own direction and feeling a bit darker, a bit grittier as the series continues. I think another really interesting author to look at from that era is Tad Williams, who also I think a lot of people recognize the classic in Tad Williams, in Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, but also feel like he was doing something that was foreshadowing what was to come in the genre at the same time. So he's writing around the same time as Robert Jordan. And of course you have George R. Martin, who is perceived as being, and I don't think he gets credit for it. And he's certainly a big part of it. But there were other authors that we've talked about before, AP, like,
Donaldson.
Stephen Donaldson, or you could go back to Gemmell, plenty of other authors who are doing it before Martin. But anyway, he gets a lot of the credit. But so there's a lot of stuff going on in the 90s, it feels like, but that's just from our current perspective. Yep. That's the thing. This are the cycles you guys have been talking about. So I think if you're to ask a reader today, what's classic fantasy, there'll be this sense that, oh, there's this somewhere in the 90s. There's this, what's before is classic, what's after is not. But that's only from our current perspective. 50 years from now, probably that won't be, the perception, right? So
I wonder, AP, in talking about, like the kind of, I hadn't even thought of it, even though I read a lot of Dragonlance at the time, of it being, I mean, I knew it came from TSR or TRS, whoever the Dungeons and Dragons people were. I knew it came from there, but I never thought of it really as, except for that first book, as really that I guess today you call it lit RPG. I never thought of it along those terms, maybe because it eventually went its other way. But with Terry Brooks, as you mentioned, I mean, Eddings, a lot of these authors that wrote in the 80s, I wonder if a lot of it, I mean, it was readers' taste, but how much of it was pushed by publishers that they were only publishing those kinds of things? Because we talked about Moorcock earlier when Bridger brought that up. I almost think of Moorcock, at least stylistically, as a more modern author. And I kind of think the same thing with Donaldson. I mean, it's been a long time since I read Thomas Covenant, but yeah. I remember that feeling so different from everything else that I was reading at the time, which was Brooks and Eddings and those kinds of guys. So I wonder if just the publishing industry itself kind of forced a lot of kind of the sameness that we felt in the 1980s.
The answer there is just look at the blurbs on the books from those eras. If you look at the 80s, it's Lord of the Rings meets whatever. And then you look at the blurbs from post 90s and it's a Game of Thrones meets whatever, right? So there's your answer, I think.
Yeah.
But there was also a thing, well, the first D&D book was Andre Norton's Quag Keep, which is actually from the 70s. And it features, do you remember the old D&D cartoon about the kids who fall into the D&D world? And they basically, that's what Quag Keep is. And they have these bracelets that have the dice on it. So when they try to do something, the dice roll. And, a couple of them get critical failures at very inopportune moments. But RPGs and that style, that was becoming really, really popular. So when people talk about, oh, lit RPG is this new thing, you're like, yeah, new in the 70s. But again, from our perspective, and a lot of it has to do with our knowledge of the past and our knowledge of the genre and how the genre has evolved. If you've only been reading fantasy for the last 20 years, lit RPG might seem new, but it's well established from those, which in academia, there was a very impolite term for it, which was extruded fantasy product.
The pink slime of fantasy genre, is that right?
Yeah. And I've always thought that was unduly harsh. Yeah, because 99% of everything is crap. But there were some exceptional things. And stylistically, the approach taken to fantasy about these stories and how that was replicated in computer games, which became massively popular, that altered how we read and approach fantasy. The rise of hard magic and magic systems. Like, you wouldn't have had that without role-playing games leading into computer games. That would not have happened. That is so fundamentally tied to the mechanics of gaming, those ludic constructs, and the popularity of them. There was an appetite for them. And so catering to that appetite is one thing, and then reacting against it for the people who were tired of that, wanted something new, or weren't satisfied by it. But you look at Donaldson and the Thomas Covenant books. Are they inspired by the Lord of the Rings? Well, without the Lord of the Rings, we probably wouldn't have had Donaldson's Thomas Covenant. But at the same time, we're the similarities between it, like, they are so radically divergent in tone and approach, and even in style, that the idea of the anti-hero, someone who you loathe, who does a horrible act in the very first book, that we then have to follow, and we grapple with that psychology all the way through, and this disbelief in, or sorry, unbelief, I should say, the unbelief in this world that he finds himself, and the psychological ramifications of that is so radically different to what Tolkien did, and yet we can see it as part of the same continuum of taking aspects and then using them in a different way, which is what we want in innovation in literature, taking things and doing things differently. But Donaldson, I think, was hugely important in forcing us as readers and forcing the market to realize that fantasy didn't have to be childish. Fantasy didn't have to be just for kids or teens. That fantasy could be truly grown up, truly adult, and not in the sense of gratuitous sex and gratuitous violence, but adult in terms of its depth, complexity, and what it was trying to achieve. Whether or not it achieves that for us individually is a different thing. But what Donaldson did with Covenant, that took the tradition of fantasy in a different way than either Brooks or Jordan did. And I think that is one of the key texts, one of the absolutely essential texts at the formation, at the heart of the genre.
I completely agree. In fact, it's in some respects, maybe not quite a dividing line, maybe a fuzzy dividing line in some respects, in that prior to then, and even after then for a long time, I think a lot of fantasy in how characters were portrayed and just how stories were told, you had a focus on what the characters do. You get lots of descriptions of, okay, they did this, they smote this, monster, they, found a magic ring, they traveled through fens and bogs, they did things. But the stories didn't really get inside their heads. It didn't really capture what they were thinking and what they were feeling. I mean, to some extent, there were, the third person omniscient viewpoints saying, well, character so-and-so thought this. But as a reader, there was a distance, a remoteness in how the stories were written. And the Thomas Covenant books subverted that. I mean, you were very much in Covenant's head, for better or for worse. And I'm a very big fan of the first trilogy, and I really like the second trilogy. And well, the final Chronicles, we'll just ignore them completely from my perspective. But those were so, for me, because I read them when I was probably 12, 11, something. I mean, it was shortly after I read The Hobbit, and I discovered them and went, wow, this is just so adult and so different from anything I'd read before. And that focus now in a lot of fantasy fiction, where you have a lot more first person point of view narratives. You have a lot more of the even third person limited perspective that really gets into the heads of the characters, and you can develop a greater connection to them and what they're feeling, and evoking an emotional response, a sympathetic response in the reader, I think is so much more prevalent today than it used to be. And that kind of remoteness of the writing in the past, and some of that remoteness was probably stylistic, just the language that was being used. A lot of writers, Jack Vance, for example, I'm kind of immersed in Vance. I'm working on a video about him right now, but he's the ultimate stylist, very ornamented writing, extremely descriptive, beautiful descriptions. But do you ever really get inside the heads of the characters? Sort of at times, but he's not really focused on characterization. That's not his strong suit.
You're onto something important there, Bridger, I think, because you know how many times you hear the term character-driven these days? And a lot of people will say, I'm a character-driven reader. I know AP loves that term. but it's true. And I this is something I've struggled to articulate myself in the past when talking about say, A Wizard of Earthsea, which there is a remoteness in comparison to what a lot of modern writers, or at least in our current era, are doing. They're trying to get, as you say, omniscient perspective is very rare these days. Pure omniscient narrative perspective, very rare. But it's, as you say, more limited omniscient with a strong focus on a POV character or even a first-person narration. Whereas in some of these older works, like Wizard of Earthsea, for example, you have a kind of remoteness. There's a less explanation of what's going on inside the character's head, and I encounter a lot of people who are more accustomed to the current era's style, who say, "I just can't get into this. I don't relate with this character enough." I hear that sort of thing a lot. So I think you might be onto something important there, as a distinction between these little eras that we're focusing on here.
Well, part of this is with a lot of the fantasy. Remember, a story being told to you is not the same as a story that you're experiencing. And in our contemporary era, we are thinking very much about immersive fantasy as the thing that we want. But even within mainstream literary fiction, character psychology and the exploration of character psychology was a relatively new thing in the early 20th century, that it didn't become the predominant norm until the 20th century went on, and it slowly filters into these other things. But so it's not necessarily omniscience as the point of view that does this, but the attitude of the narrative, and omniscience lends to this. But a narrative being told to you is not the same as a narrative that you're experiencing. And third person limited, quite often, because of that focalization into the character experience, can draw a reader in. But that's why first person present is the sort of the go-to for immediacy and really bringing the reader in. And it's one of the reasons why that's much more popular in younger targeted fiction.
Yeah.
To have that immediacy, that the reader feels immersed in it. But then the stepping back to the third person limited for a slightly older audience, because there are limitations and strengths to both approaches. Omniscience can be used just to be just as immersive, but people tend to write it off and go, "Oh, it's just that." But third person limited, you get third person limited objective, third person limited semi-omniscient, and the multiple POVs. These are all different techniques, and how they are deployed can actually affect immersiveness. But but those are trends that happen, and psychological realism is something that evolved predominantly in the 20th century.
So, AP, I have a question for you. And I mean, Philip, you too. You both have more expertise in this particular question than I do by far, because it's Malazan related. And so I read the first couple of books in the Malazan series, 20 plus years ago when they were first being written. And then I stopped because I realized, okay, this is way too complicated to wait a year between each book and be able to remember everything that happened and all the different characters. And so I shelved it thinking I'll come back to it. Well, other things got in the way and I never got back to it until recently. And I did reread Gardens of the Moon not long ago with the intent to continue. And very impressive piece of work. I mean, it reinforced my general impression from when I read it more than 20 years ago. But the thing is when I read it more than 20 years ago, as I thought back on it before this recent reread, I could not remember very much in terms of specifics about it. I remembered a general sense of complexity, a general sense of kind of a lot of thematic depth, general sense of an overwhelming number of characters and extreme world building in some respects. And so as I reread it, I was thinking maybe more critically this time about what makes it different from some of the other fantasy I've read in the interim over the past 20 years. And certainly the world building sets it apart. But I have to say, I I thought there was a lot of focus on characters, but at the same time, I didn't feel a lot of character development. Granted, this is book one in a more than 10 book series, so context matters there. But it was almost as if there were too many characters, too many different storylines that were being juggled in that first book, which actually subtracted, from my experience at least, a connection to characters. Even though I liked some of the characters, I think where I think some of them are going to end up going in the series. But how does that reconcile with what I was just describing and AP were describing about this kind of psychological evolution, the closeness to the characters that Malazan, which I think is very much a modern work, maybe struggles with a little bit?
I'll give a quick answer because I know AP is going to have way more to say. but just to be real quick here, my answer is to go back to your point, Bridger, about subversion. And if we're using that particular criterion, Malazan is not classic fantasy. It is not. And the fact of the matter is, though, if you look at literature as a whole, Malazan does things that have been going on in literature for a long time. It's just that it's subversive within the context of fantasy. So, and one of those things is what you're talking about. Malazan doesn't give us the hero of the story. It doesn't give us a group of characters that we follow along with, and we know that we're rooting for, and it instead gives us this very universal perspective of an individual lost or within this vast context of this story, this epic, this world. And in that sense, I feel that Erikson and Esselmont as well, and both Malazan authors do this, they give us a truer sense of our place in the universe. They're actually deliberately being subversive in many cases. And this is one of the, I think, clearest examples of where they're not following the script for fantasy. And it throws a lot of people when they start Malazan, especially if they're predominantly fantasy readers. And they come to Malazan and they're, where's the hero? Who am I supposed to be rooting for here? You know, and it doesn't give you that. So that's a quick answer.
That's a great point, because I one of the things that I came away with after rereading it was just how much ambiguity is in the story. That I liked a lot of characters, but I didn't know if they were good guys or bad guys. I didn't know much of anything, and it was clearly intentional. And yet it created distance for me as a reader that I think is at odds with the broader trend in fantasy. And that's what I was kind of driving at. But I agree with what you said, Philip. I mean, that makes sense. AP, your turn.
Well, I can tell you that both Erikson and Esselmont have spoken about it quite extensively, but Erikson in particular, he was trying to write a postmodern deconstruction of his perception of what fantasy was. So that's where you get that sense of intentionality, that you are witness to events, but you don't have the context. And you go, so what is that telling us about Erikson's perception of what fantasy is? That quite often we're given all of the context and we understand everything, but that's not reflective of how we perceive life. So Erikson deconstructs that. We're used to having the core characters. Do we have core characters in this? And well, we're introduced to Gano's parent, and he has a sword that has a name, and except he got that sword without doing anything. He's never drawn it in combat, and he gets murked really early on. That, oh well, there's a deliberate subversion of our expectation about the chosen one hero. That's done away with. The use of indirect characterization, because we are so used to direct characterization in fantasy. So Erikson just does the opposite. We're used to a nice linear delineation of here's where the story is going. We're going to have our introduction, we're going to have our instigating event, and our rising action, as if this 19th century structure is the only way to write. He does away with that, and he plays very much in that postmodernist revelry of ambiguity, of shifting and subjective perception of reality, and that morality is complex, and it is an investigation of that, not dictating to the reader, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. Think of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. There are, even with some of the more complex characters, there is a good side and a bad side. The morality of the Lord of the Rings is very starkly binary. And we forgive the good guys doing horrendous things because they did it for the side of good. So when the orcs are wiped out by the Ents and the Huron after the Battle of Helm's Deep and the Battle of the Hornburg, that's a mass genocide. But yay, the good guys did it. We're fine with that because that's the narrative telling us the good guys did it. And this was a good thing that they did. And Erickson goes, no, here's a bunch of guys that have been sent in to disrupt the city. So they're going to place mines in the thoroughfares, the civilian thoroughfares. They're going to mine these junctions. Are these the good guys? Why do we assume they're the good guys? Because we started with them. We have a narrative bias because we started with their point of view. And he plays with narrative bias that we see in all of these things. How many fantasy novels have we read where it's about some person and they're going to do this thing? We start with them and we go, there's our main character. And that is the perspective all the way through. And Eric says, why? Let's play with that. I know what your expectations are going to be. And of course, he was writing this. He and Esselmont were both writing in the 80s. And this was finished up in the early 90s, but didn't get published until much later on. So a lot of the fantasy he was reacting to was fantasy from the 70s and 80s. And he was drawing on the influences of him as a writer from stuff that he had read and studied at the workshops and things that had impressed him, and then drawing from films. But what makes it stand out for me is it was trying knowledge of the genre and what the genre does gives you this completely different lens through which to view and understand Gardens of the Moon. But if you don't have that, you can still read it as this military fantasy story that is ambiguous about, here's the soldiers going on their thing. And you're like, they must be the good guys. Well, hang on, they're colonial oppressors. How can they be the good guys? Here's the city defending against them. They must be the good guys. Well, actually, they do shitty things as well. How can they be the good guys? Why do we insist on simplistic moral binaries? And you go, is that something that is relatively common in the fantasy genre? And the rise of grimdark and the complexity of this moral grayness. We see the rise of that because, yes, that was a reaction against the perception of simplistic moral binaries. And Gardens of the Moon is part of that, but it does a bunch of other things as well. But anyway, that would be what I'm talking about, or how I would see it. This postmodern deconstruction of a lot of perceived tropes, styles, approaches, modes, and concepts within fantasy that Erickson and Esselmont saw at the time. They wanted to deconstruct, but they wanted to deconstruct by using them, not simply, I'm not going to use it, I'm going to do something different.
Yeah. Some of these trends can actually go across purposes.
Yeah, let me circle back to AP, talking about this, but also what you talked about earlier about the cyclical nature of fantasy with a lot of the different trends. So if we look at it from that lens and we look at, Erickson obviously is one model of a fantasy author. Philip, what you were talking about in regards to characterization, like a first-person narrative, of course, I go straight to Robin Hobb, obviously a very modern kind of author. Can we kind of project backwards and see, because of the modern trends being reactions, because I see this in music all the time, different eras are reacting and trying to be more modern, as simply, is it that simple of an answer that the more modern authors are reacting against traditional?
Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence. Adopt, adapt, adapt. You have perceived norms, some of which you like, some of which you don't. Authors and artists, they go, I really like how they did that thing, but I would have done it this way to make it different. And that's where we get distinct author voices from. So it's not simply, this is how everyone is doing it, I'm going to be different because I'm super special. Moorcock reacted against his perception of fantasy in exactly this, in a very similar way that Erikson did. But what they produced, radically different works. But you can see with Moorcock and the Elric stuff, the gothic horror elements to it, the darkness to it, as a direct answer to what he saw as saccharine in Tolkien. With Erikson and Gardens of the Moon and the Malazan stuff, the influence of Vietnam War fiction and the influence of that sort of style of storytelling, embedding the story with the grunts on the ground, not the nobles and the princes and the kings and the princesses going on their quests, a la Raymond E. Feist or David Eddings or David Gemmell. That no, these are the grunts, these are the commoners and what they go through. That it's not just reactionary, because we are influenced by everything that we have consumed. And there's this entire cauldron of what the different narrative elements, what worked, what didn't, tricks that people used. But then some authors, I think, feel a drive where they go, if I was writing that story, how would I have written it? Because I didn't like where this went. This is where I would do it. And they then create that. And it's not necessarily that it's a reaction against. It's building on. It's utilizing their point and place in culture and time and understanding of narrative.
Yeah.
That changes decade to decade. Like our influences today are so radically different from 20 years ago. The impact of streaming and the internet we can see in today's writing, whereas you couldn't see it in the 1990s, even though, the internet existed, some people had access to it, but the generational influence takes time to accumulate. And that radically shifts and changes things.
Yeah.
The type of language used, at the level of literacy that we have in schools, the type of literature that students practice on and grow up reading, that has changed over time. And all of these things blend together to create new visions. And so when Bridget was talking about Fourth Wing earlier, Fourth Wing, if that story had been written 30 years ago, it would have been in radically different language, but it probably would have been the language of the teenagers of 30 years ago. It's written in the language of teenagers today because that's the market for it. Even if it was exactly the same story with exactly the same characters going through exactly the same motions, it's trying to reach that type of person and therefore is in the language of the audience, not necessarily the language of the character. And again, we play with notions of this, that making things authentic to the world is one approach. Making things authentic for the reader is a different approach, and one that has become far more prevalent post the whole Le Mort d'Auteur, the death of the author, and the focus on reader response and reader interaction and fan interaction.
Just to reiterate a point and agree with AP, subversion is still, I know it happens once in a while. Subversion is still engagement. So when an author is subverting a trope, they are still engaging with that trope. They are still drawing from that same cauldron, as AP referred to it. And I think that's kind of a cool thing, actually.
I was going to say that something AP kind of touched on, and I may build on it a little more explicitly. When you look at kind of external influences on the genre, that it's not just the authors coming up with, ideas that react to previous authors' works. They're also reacting to the world around them. And I think it was Moorcock, but I may be mistaken, who made a very broad statement, and I'm not sure it's actually applicable to all cases, but I think there's some validity to it, that fantasy is the expression of the author's anxieties. Only some authors try to escape or conceal those anxieties, whereas other authors try to grapple with them. Moorcock put himself in the grappling category, where there were major issues, controversies, fears at different points in our history. I mean, going outside of fantasy, I mean, in science fiction, you can trace this, each major war through the last century and a half spawned its own flavor of science fiction and what it focused on and the kinds of fears that were being expressed in that fiction. Fantasy is the same way. But which anxieties are most salient for a particular generation or just for a particular time period tend to change. And that I think manifests itself in the fiction that's being written. Go ahead, AP.
I was about to say, Murkoch's exactly right, but it's that again. That is not unique to fantasy. That's every writer,
right?
Yes. That's all fiction. That's what these authors and playwrights and poets do is they explore these things, and whether or not it's an exploration in a positive and conciliatory fashion, or it's an exploration to directly confront, or it's like this is one of the driving motivations for authors, for writers of all types. That I don't think it's unique to fantasy, but I think what fantasy and science fiction both do really well is they allow the exploration of some very difficult things, some very difficult concepts and abstract, by placing them in a secondary distant world, by giving us that distance to explore it in a different way and to think about it. Science fiction and fantasy and horror, the speculative fictions in general, allow us to grapple with and engage with some deeply complex and difficult, horrendous aspects of the human condition, of our history, of various conflicts. And you could take a modern military conflict that is ongoing, and if you wrote a story about that, yeah, it's going to be about that thing, but your reader approaching it is going to have a predisposition, and they're going to have prejudged what side they are on, and you're constantly having to battle that. But if you took what happened, you place it in a fantasy world, then it allows freedom to explore different avenues and different expressions in such a way as to better understand the situation contextually, without condemnation that you've been too sympathetic to one side or not sympathetic enough to one side. And that's a wonderful thing that that fiction does, but that the speculative fictions, the non-mimetic fictions, really is one of their key strengths, is that they can do this. They can take it out into these other realms and allow us to explore that without the knee-jerk reaction, or, well, I must side with, which so much of social media has turned into. Are you saying the right things? Doesn't matter what you actually do, but are you saying the right things? And literature is a way of exploring points of view that aren't our own, a way of engaging with complex ideas and thinking through it so that we have a more nuanced understanding. And it may not change our position, but we'll understand our position better.
So to summarize for you, Josh, this entire conversation, we have utterly failed to define classic fantasy. But we might have said some cool things.
But we've hit a lot of the key points, which I think still apply. I mean, we talked about differences in prose between kind of more classic or traditional, whatever you want to call it, and modern. We talked about difference of characterization for modern trends versus classical trends. We talked about the treatment of different themes, how that kind of branched a little bit with, I don't know if you call it a branch with Moorcock. I mean, you could almost see like kind of a parting, because you did see after that some authors kind of following Moorcock's approach versus Tolkien's approach. But
even with
some of these,
he's part of something bigger, really. Yeah.
But when we go back to a lot of the earlier stuff, like when you Bridget was mentioning Jack Vance earlier, like those texts, those stories, because they weren't written. A lot of the earlier stories weren't written with this idea of the genre of fantasy. As a result, they aren't evocations or attempting to evoke the perceived norm, because there was no perceived norm to evoke. And in some respects, a lot of the earlier short stories and weird tales and strange tales where these fantastical stories turned up, they were operating in a much freer space because there wasn't the perceived genre boundaries. And authors like Vance, they did amazing things that don't fit neatly with a lot of our modern perception of what fantasy is. But you look at Robert E. Hard's Conan stuff, the Hyborian stuff. Well, is it really a secondary world? Well, no, it's ancient Earth history. Is it, or is it operating the same way that secondary world does? When you look at John Carter of Mars and the Barzoom stuff, is that science fiction or is that the fantasy adventure? Like, do we see the influence of the Western and the idealized individual hero with their own set of morals who walks into town to sort out the bad guys? The impact of that style of narrative on a lot of these heroic or adventure stories of the powerful lone hero who then gathers the supporting posse. You're like, oh, a quest group. Like we see that time and time again. How much of that was due to the popularity of the Western and the individualized hero and the perennially, as was Diana Wynne Jones called it, the perennially understaffed forces of good against the overwhelming evil? The way that Westerns are set up, because it's the small core of good guys who go up against the evil big gang and the corrupt mayor. The repetition of those patterns, and you can see how they influence things.
It's funny you bring up Westerns, because when I reviewed Lonesome Dove, I said that it was epic fantasy set in the West because it was a fellowship on a quest. It was following two of my favorite things about more traditional fantasy. Well, to kind of wrap things up, I want to just address one more thing I'd like to get from each of you. I always encounter my own videos or discords or comment section of other people's videos, people that only read or predominantly read more modern fantasy, and they're always reluctant to go back and try. What are some of the works that each of you think are maybe good entry points for a modern fantasy reader to read classic fantasy? As an example, I'll give you the bad example. I would never tell a modern reader to go read the Belgariad, because it's so formulaic. And as much as I love it and have read it many times in my life, a modern fantasy reader is not going to like it because he embraces literally all the tropes. What are some of the works that you think a modern fantasy reader could pick up and find a value and be able to maybe start dipping their toe into the waters of reading some of these older, more traditional or classic works?
Wow. Oh, that's a big question. I mean, I mentioned Chad Williams earlier. Maybe that would be a good candidate, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. Although they'd have to get used to a more, more description than they're probably accustomed to and that sort of thing. I'm always an advocate for Le Guin's Earthsea books. I think they're fantastic, but that would also require that adjustment I talked about earlier, especially if they're describing themselves as character-driven readers. But those would be two that I could think of.
I'd probably go with Donaldson and the Thomas Covenant books. Like, along with Tolkien, I think that Donaldson's Thomas Covenant is one of the most important works in the genre. And if you want to understand how the genre functions, if you want to understand how the genre develops, then being aware of what Donaldson did, I think, is integral to that, is really important. If they want something that's going to be slightly more fun, David Gemmell, and it doesn't really matter which one you pick because they're all basically the same, but they're fun. And but again, that is illustrative of a particular pattern and a particular style, and you realize what Gemmell is doing and why he kept evoking the same things. And once you gotten onto the pattern, there's still some fun ones. The Knights of Dark Renown, which is a fantasy rewrite of an historical fiction called The Knights of Dark Renown, unimaginatively enough, which was about the Second Crusades. But Gemmell rewrote basically the historical fiction, which was the historical fiction based on the historical event. But The Knights of Dark Renown was an interesting
one. I will second both of your recommendations. I think they're excellent recommendations. And depending on what a reader prefers, I would say maybe Glenn Cook. If someone is into more of the darker, grimmer, more ambiguous style of writing, somebody like that. I think Roger Zelazny's Amber Chronicles, certainly the first Chronicles, are illustrative of a writer blending genres, which is something that tends to happen, I think, more frequently now than it used to, although you could find examples going back a long ways. But that was a very, very influential work when it came out in the 1970s. And I think holds up very well today. And Zelazny's writing, excuse me, I think still feels relatively modern compared to a lot of maybe older writers. But I would also look at works that have been written recently that feel traditional as a way to bridge that divide. I think in many cases there are readers who operate with kind of a confirmation bias, that they think, well, old is bad or traditional is bad, or that it just doesn't feel right because maybe they've tried one or two things in the past and it just didn't work for them. And so giving them an introduction through a modern work that actually is part of that cyclical reinvention of older styles of stories might be a way to bridge the gap. I mean, I'll give a few examples. Marie Brennan's Lady Trent series, starting with the Natural History of Dragons, that is a direct throwback to the works of more than 100 years ago, H. Rider Haggard and Kipling and Talbot Mundy, and they're fun. But boy, are they traditional. They are. I mean, it's non-traditional in that you have a female protagonist, which would not have been the case in a Talbot Mundy or an H. Rider Haggard story of that nature. But the way the stories are told are incredibly traditional and well done. Cozy fantasy. Hope Mirrlees's Live in the Mist is a great story, but it's very cozy. It's not going to appeal to a grimdark kind of reader, probably. But if you are interested in understanding kind of the roots of where these newer works are coming from, that's a fun place to start. Dandelion Dynasty, and I think I mentioned this Joanna's stream a couple of weeks ago. I'm halfway through reading Dandelion Dynasty, and my reaction is positive. I'm enjoying it. I quite like it. But my reaction as I was reading it was, this doesn't feel modern. It felt very traditional in terms of some of the criteria that we've been describing, the characterization, how inside the head of the characters are you really able to get, the distance between the reader and the story. Certainly there's some fairly elaborate world building, but even then there's not a lot of depth to it. It's more breadth, but not so much depth, which seems more typical of older types of works. So if you like Dandelion Dynasty, that suggests that you might actually like some of the older style fantasies that were written. I mean, Dandelion Dynasty is absolutely bigger, the scale, scope, complexity is a little more than what you'd have in an older work. But I definitely got a sense of an older one. Or Sebastian de Castel's Trader's Blades, the Great Cloaks or Great Coats series. It has that picaresque aspect to it that has a long tradition. And is it a perfect story? No. But if you enjoy that, you probably would enjoy a fair number of older works too, both in the fantasy genre, maybe some of the older historical fiction type of picaresques out there. I mean, those are just a few that seem older. Or the books of Babel, Josiah Bancroft's, the Semlin books, those things feel very not entirely traditional because they're so strange at the same time. There's a weirdness to them. But it's a weirdness that does have analogs going back 100 years, or even just 40 years to Gene Wolfe, in how you have the perspective of the narrator and the being lost as a reader, trying to understand, okay, what actually is going on, and you're just as lost as the narrator is in the process. There's a long tradition of that, and I think it's done well in the Sinlin books.
Very well. Yeah. Brilliant prose.
Yeah, I was going to say Chris Wooding or Philip Chase. Those two authors, the Ember Blade or the Way of Edan, certainly along those lines. Do have.
Well, you can't recommend the Way of Edan. You can't recommend the Nemesis.
I have been accused of blending classic and modern a few times in reviews in my trilogy. Yeah, in my case, I'd say it goes back to Beowulf probably, but also I read Tolkien in a very impressionable. I had to say Beowulf at some point in this conversation.
Contractually obligated.
I was absolutely contractually obligated to say Beowulf at some point, but yeah, that's true, and that's very conscious and deliberate from me. So yeah, thanks for mentioning it, guys.
Well, I will say I really enjoyed this discussion. Again, I don't know if we came up with a definitive answer, but I think a lot of the things I really enjoy just the three of you and your perspectives and your expertise. That's why I wanted to put this together, and I appreciate your time this morning. And those of you that did watch today or whenever I post this, drop us a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. And if you have a recommendation for a modern reader to maybe dip their toe into classic or more traditional fantasy, I would love to hear those. But I want to once again thank all three of you for coming and hanging out this morning, and I'll see you all soon.